Hey, everybody. I'm Chris Muntz, host of the Chorosophy podcast. Welcome to episode 2, part 1 of advocating for our art form. I had to add a part 1, as I said in one of the pre-production update episodes, because this conversation kind of expanded beyond what I had originally scripted. And my original thought was to talk specifically about music education, but then I started having trouble in my mind separating music education from the performing of music in the community, um, the composer's career, the performer's career, all of the things that extend beyond the classroom to bringing music to people outside of an academic environment. That seemed very inseparable to me, in the sense that I want to talk about, or I want us all to be thinking about how music that we teach students in the classroom translates then out into the air quotes real world. So this episode has been divided into 2 parts. First, you'll hear a conversation that I had with Dr. Elise Hepworth, who is a music education advocacy expert. So I brought her on to talk about some of the issues facing the music education advocacy effort on a kind of a national and state level, and some of the issues that goes along with that. And then in part 2, you'll hear a conversation with Dale Trumbore, who is a composer and a person who kind of lives on the other side of that, which is that she makes her living writing music and publishing music and getting people to perform her music. So she has a different approach to the art form, but one that I view as interdependent on the music education that most of us do. For part 1 of this episode, I have partnered with Ryan Main, who is an awesome composer and arranger and educator, to sponsor this episode. RyanMain.com is an awesome resource, especially if you teach middle school and high school students, for some original compositions and arrangements that you won't find from the big publishers, but ones that are really well tailored to those age levels and just excite kids and get them sounding great. So one of the things that I like about Ryan's music is that it is accessible, but also challenging enough to keep really smart kids interested. One of my challenges as a teacher is that at competition time, I combine my 9th grade boys with all of my experienced 10th through 12th grade boys. And so I'm currently teaching them his Didn't My Lord Deliver Daniel, which is an awesome arrangement, a cappella. It's got some body percussion, lots of mixed meter, really exciting arrangement of that familiar spiritual. But one of the cool things about that arrangement is that my 9th grade boys are into it right away because they can access it, they can understand it. It's gonna take them a while to get it, but it's also intricate and interesting enough that my 12th grade boys are really into it too. And I've been doing those combination ensembles for quite a while, and I'll tell you, that's a hard thing to find. And I find that Ryan's music is that way in a lot of cases, so I encourage you to check him out. So before we go to the conversation with Dr. Hepworth, I'll just start with a few of my own thoughts about music education advocacy and why I think it's so important that it not only got an episode, but a big, long 2-part episode. I think that oftentimes as music teachers, we take for granted that other people understand what we understand, which is that none of us would be doing what we do. And again, now I'm talking to music teachers, but also community choir directors, church choir directors. We wouldn't be doing what we do if at some point in our formative years we had some kind of life-changing experience from music that caused a change in the way we saw the world, and the medium through which that change happened was some kind of musical experience and probably some kind of an ensemble experience. That being in a place with other singers, with other players, achieving something together, something that's extremely intellectually stimulating, but also heart stimulating. So we get that. Where I think sometimes we fall short is that we don't necessarily understand at a cognitive level enough that other people don't understand that. In other words, I don't think it's weird or strange that someone might make a comment on Facebook or in a state legislature, for example, uh, that maybe funding for the arts isn't all that important. Maybe we should focus on more practical subject matters, things that'll get you a quote real job, right? I think from what I see from many of my colleagues, um, the first reaction to those types of comments, especially if they're on social media, I mean, it's just worse there, as we all know, tend to be quite angry. And I'm just not really a person that likes to go to that level of response, and so I tend to sit back and watch those conversations happening online or even sometimes in person, where anger is a response that I don't really understand to that type of worldview. So I'll use as an example, again, a legislator or maybe someone in your neighborhood who flat out says arts education isn't that important. Well, to me, I know he's wrong, or she, but I also don't have any reason to expect that that person should just inherently know that it's true. In other words, at some point along the way, if a person feels that way, it's very likely that that person has not had the same experiences that I had with music, and or they might just not be a musically wired person. In other words, music isn't for everyone. And that might sound controversial coming from a music teacher, uh, but I believe that to be true. I think some people are not wired for sound, so to speak. They're just, that's not how they perceive the world. It's not how they interact with the world. I'll share an example of kind of the flip side of that, and many of you could probably identify with this. I grew up in church, as a lot of you probably did. My mother was a church choir director and church music director. And I learned very early on that my ability to connect spiritually with what was going on in the church happened when the music started. The sermons I found, interesting as I got older, and I got some level of intellectual stimulation, some knowledge maybe from those, but I never really felt the spirit, so to speak, unless the music was happening. That's where I got my connection. But what I also needed to recognize was that not everyone is that way. So the moral of the story for me, and why I thought these episodes on music education advocacy were so important, is that I think we need to shed or molt the skin, the rough skin that some of us have when we hear people talking about on a public policy level and on a personal level that arts aren't important and arts education isn't important, and maybe not respond in anger, but respond with a greater level of creativity and ingenuity in telling our stories, in increasing the amount of children, students, adults that are impacted the way we were impacted. And I think the barrier between us doing that is the assumption that if someone doesn't already see music the way we see it, that they are somehow a troglodyte, an ill-informed person, somebody who just doesn't uh, see love or beauty. And I think that's a bit condescending, and I think we should just flat out stop it. We've got to stop reacting that way. I think it's one thing to say to a person respectfully, I think you're missing the mark here. Here's my story. Here's what music did for me. And it was more than just fluff, which is another kind of issue that I take with some music advocacy that I see, is that I also wish we would stop justifying music because it's a quote different way for kids to learn, or it's a way for them to improve their math scores, or whatever. No, it's got its own inherent um, qualities. It's got its own inherent values that make it important, that make it inseparable from good education. So I think what we really should be trying to do is to codify and unify the story that we tell when we come across people who don't value what we do. And at the same time, recognizing that there is room in the world for people who have no connection to music at a spiritual level, at an intellectual level. Maybe there are some people who genuinely wouldn't get any value out of what we do. And we need to allow for that too, in my opinion. I think they are it's a two-edged sword, double-edged sword, in the sense that we want to tell our story and want to increase the number of people that participate, the number of people that really benefit from what we do. Of course we want to do that. But at the same time, I think we could probably avoid the assumption that everybody knows what we know. So with that thought in mind of kind of where I'm coming from on the topic, I'll go ahead and switch over now to stream an already recorded conversation with Dr. Elise Hepworth. I hope you enjoy. So I'm here with Dr. Elise Hepworth. She is the Director of Choral Activities at Missouri Western State University. She's also the chair of the Missouri Music Educators Association's Advancing Music Education Committee. She's also the co-chair of the Music Advocacy Network Council. And also, for those of you out there listening, full disclosure, a really good friend of mine. So I thought she would be a perfect choice for me to sit down and chat with about spreading the word as it relates to music education advocacy. And for me, that means just being able to communicate to people why what we do is so important. With the organizations she's a part of, it might have more meaning, more kind of an official meaning, and communicating with legislators and administrators and in an official capacity. But for a lot of us who are just teachers out there doing our work with kids and parents, it could just be, how do we talk to people about what it is that we do? So I'm going to start by asking Elise one of the things that I think is an important first step for advocating for music education, and it's something that we all can do, and it's something that we should probably do every single day. And I actually think about that when someone says, ask me what I do for a living. I think about how I answer that question as the first step in music education advocacy. So how do you explain your job to people, Elise, when people ask you what you do?
Well, thanks for inviting me on your podcast. I'm really excited to be sharing about advocacy. And I usually say that I am a teacher. I very rarely specify what level that I teach, because I so strongly identify with the idea that I am providing education in music, in the content area of music, to not only just the college age students that I have the privilege of working with, but folks in elementary ed, middle school, high school, and just continuing education in the community. So I first say I'm a teacher. People will usually ask, what kind of teacher are you? I say, I teach music, and that's pretty much as far as it goes.
Okay. So what if I don't know if you've ever come across this. I know I have, where you say you teach music, and people will, if they decide to take the conversation further, reveal some kind of dramatically misunderstood concept of what it means to teach music, especially if they were never a serious music student or they don't know anyone in that profession. What do you tell that person?
Oh, I share that music is just the vehicle of which I am trying to develop people into being human beings. I think that music is, it's so much more than just the content area of music. People think that music would be easy because you're having fun all day and you're singing and you're playing games. How much fun would that be, just to go to work and play all day? But I talk about developing individuals, and especially in the area of soft skills. We've talked about soft skills. We've heard that buzzword in the business world, and that means the ability to communicate effectively, the ability to problem solve, the ability to even make eye contact and carry on a meaningful conversation with another person. But yeah, I think that really reaches a lot of folks and stops them dead in their tracks when I talk about developing humans, creating humans, and especially developing in the area of soft skills.
Yeah. How do you feel about, I know at the college level, your interaction with the students' parents is probably a little bit less than mine at the high school level, but do you interact with parents at all of your college students, or is that really just like
I
a,
do. No, this is my 11th year in higher ed. It's my 16th year in education overall. And I feel like in the past few years, 3 years specifically, I think that I've had more parent engagement. I don't have parent complaints, but they are in touch with me more often, checking in with their students. I can't reveal certain information for federal privacy acts, but education. But I do. I have a lot of contact with parents.
hmm
Surprisingly, especially when parents come in to concerts. Folks always want to talk to me and speak with me and ask me how they're doing, and I have an opportunity to speak with them on a more of a surface level about their children.
this is a slightly off-topic question, but do you think that's different than when we were students? Do you feel like that's a different world?
Absolutely, I think that uh, parental involvement in higher education is much different than it was. I graduated in 2001, so that's been 18 years ago this spring, and I I didn't really communicate very much with my professors, let alone my parents. I think that
hmm
I attended a lot of concerts and would approach my instructors and say, "Thank you for this concert. Thank you for that." And that's about as far as it went. Um, I also feel like, but I feel like relationships in higher ed have evolved and changed as well. I think more university professors are a lot more open, and maybe that's just my perception as now being a teacher and sitting on the other side of the table rather than being a student. But yeah, I think that has changed drastically in the
Yeah,
last 8 years.
that's got to be true. I mean, I can say with 100% certainty that father, my mother had passed away before I went to college, but with my father never spoke or wrote anything ever to any of my teachers in college. That would just have been an anathema to admit even to your friends that that your dad's getting in your business in college. It's an interesting thing, and I wonder too if that shift in culture has also changed the job of a music professor or a music educator at the at the collegiate level as it relates to music education advocacy. Because when in our day, so to speak, the assumption would have been that if a student is at the college level studying music, that job of convincing people of what we do is important has already been done. The justification of your job uh, would come into play. I would say more. How does that ring true at all?
It does, but I view my position a little bit differently, and I think this is kind of a trend also in tertiary ed that faculty, I can talk, maybe speak on behalf of some of my colleagues that they feel the same way, but I feel more impassioned and responsible for also supporting my colleagues in elementary and middle and high school. So I have a greater responsibility of advocating for music education because it directly affects my colleagues in those areas. And I have the fundamental belief that a rising tide lifts all ships. The idea that if you're going to make a situation great for everyone, then it lifts and elevates the quality um, for all those around. So I really do. I do feel like, again, I'm sitting on the other side of the table from my professors, but I do feel a great amount of responsibility to help and assist, not in just supporting my own job, but then supporting my colleagues and my peers in music education, no matter what level they teach.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's an interesting perspective. That I taught at the college level only for about a year and a half adjunct, and so I wasn't really in that world, but just a very short little dose of it. But I had the same experience with, uh, that was years ago, where I don't think I ever met or spoke to a parent or had an email from a parent. Whereas at the high school level, that's something that we deal with almost on a daily basis. It's a pretty constant thing, which there's a certain amount of that that's natural, but something that's definitely changing in the culture, I would think. So I have another question for you that I'd be interested to know your take on. Um, from your, we'll call this your official positions with these music education organizations, where you're dealing with advocacy, probably in that more official sense that I met with before, about coming up with ways to communicate with legislators, administrators, all the kind of decision makers in our society that could affect in a real way how music education is delivered. What do you see as the biggest issues that we face? If you have Missouri specific things, that's great. But of course, even nationwide, how do you see that playing out?
I think one of my greatest concerns is a disconnect between people who are making important policy decisions at the state and national government level, and what's actually needed by children, and by human beings. So I feel that it may be the case that legislators might not be able to connect with the importance of music because they can't personally connect on the importance, not personally important to them, but they they may dismiss the importance. Then it may impact other individuals. So the way learners learn, I would never have been a very effective mathematician, but it doesn't mean that I'm going to discredit math altogether because I don't feel that that's important. And I worry that music, while we are co-curricular, we're a part of the regular curriculum and after school curriculum. We're kind of a part of, we're lumped into both the regular school day and then after school activities, that we lose a little footing in the after school activities because folks don't want to invest in that. So I worry a little bit about that. I worry about the fact that not every school district in the state is providing an equal number of required minutes that for children to receive music instruction. We do have a recommendation, but we don't have a requirement at our state level. And I worry that state legislators are making really important policy decisions when they should be probably left up to more local government decisions and administrative decisions.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, especially that last part. I feel like part on the more informal level of that same type of question, uh, a constant reality for me is trying to communicate to parents and to students the academic nature of what we do, as opposed to, like you just were explaining, the after school extracurricular component of what we do. So many people, I feel, only see the extracurricular side of things, and of course, if you're a parent, again, or a legislator with no direct experience to tie into a really quality music classroom, you show up to your kid's concert and you see them singing 3 or 4 songs, and it seems so easy, and they don't see what goes on behind the scenes. And so I feel like I'm constantly explaining to people, no, choir is an academic subject. It's not an activity like football. Even though I love football and I played football, I understand that football is valuable, but you can't get a PhD in football. This is an academic subject for a reason, and trying to explain that to me, like, that's the core of music education advocacy. And I think now at the legislative level, that's a trickier conversation because it's so nuanced. But how do you see our role as educators in just I'm going to use the word evangelism in
Mhm.
being evangelists for the importance of what we teach from the why perspective. Like, why are we teaching this?
Right. Well, I think that question has so many layers to it, and perhaps maybe the first question that we should be asking ourselves is, how often is it this idea of advocating for music education at the forefront of our consciousness? Is it something that we only think about in March every year because March is music, the National Association for Music Educators, the organization's Music in Our Schools month? Are we only thinking about that? Are we only thinking about it at concerts? How are we communicating to our parents? And then it becomes, what are we communicating? So um, I think that the way that we can speak to parents and administrators is frequency. And then the message needs to be kind of twofold. One, the reaching the meaning of music education from their perspective. How can we relate it to them so that they feel invested in fighting for us or fighting for our children. And then just the clarity and continuity of the message. So that kind of leads as a nice segue into a network that MMEA is getting off the ground. The Missouri Music Educators Association is beginning a advocacy network to help engage individuals that are not necessarily music educators in their profession or as a part of their vocation, but engaging those individuals at the local and the state level that are stakeholders. So even parents, administrators, booster clubs, trying to then convey frequency of message and a continuity of message to those legislators or people who are making important policy decisions.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm going to lay out. That's I think all super important. I think that as educators, we need to be careful not to let other people do all of that for us, and I think that's an important message. In my opinion, is all of our jobs to spread that word. And so in that vein, I'm going to lay out a take for you that might be uh, a little bit controversial, and I want to see what you think about it. I think that just my observation of our profession is that we currently don't do enough of that, and I've got some theories of why that is. And this idea came to me after a conversation with Simon Carrington years ago when he used to do a group in Kansas City that I got to sing in, which was really cool. And he would come for a week in the summer, and we'd have chances to talk during that week. And I heard him make an observation about the way choral music is delivered, essentially, in the United States versus what he grew up doing in the choir schools over in England. And that had to do with the pros and cons, you might say, and I'm paraphrasing wildly here of what he said, but the pros and cons of our public education centered delivery system, where the pro is that large numbers of kids are being exposed to daily music education, which is something that doesn't happen as much over there. Whereas over there, you've got these, choir schools, you've got private type institutions that are delivering excellent music education, but over here, it's a much larger percentage of the population that gets access to that stuff, which is a pro. But then the con is, and the way I've seen it and develop, is that we then might, as Americans, be taking that for granted, in the sense that it becomes something that we do over here that kids do because it's part of your school curriculum, and therefore not something that really transfers much to your life later. And of course, we all know as music teachers that's bullocks, and that's not true. There are tons of transfers into it, but I feel like the layperson, that's how they see it. They see it as a kid's activity that you do, and if you're unless you're in that tiny percentage of people who sings in their church choir, like what's the point of learning all this? Is that something that you've ever seen or thought about, or what do you think about that?
I think that's kind of a part of my ever evolving philosophy of music education. Thinking about back in the 1820s, Lowell Mason, the reason why we even have music education in our country is he took the idea that, boy, we could teach useful sequential music instruction in the public schools, and that just made such a huge difference in the Boston school district and school system that it kind of caught fire. And then I think about the philosophies of both Orff and Kodai is that music is for all. Music can be learned. It is not a it can be nurtured, but everybody is born with the innate ability and skill to practice music. I can see from his perspective that yes, when we tend to provide things and it becomes regular and a regular part of our everyday lives, that we do tend to take advantage of it. When you think about running water, gosh, I think I take advantage of running water every day. I just turn on a
Hmm.
tap, it's there, but it doesn't mean it's any less important. And we do need to have some of it is just a cultural shift in our community. Some of it is an entertainment we see as entertainment. And like you had said, it's very rigorous and academic. But we think of what we're grossly exposed to it in our society is it's on the radio, it's on TV, it's in the stores, it's at gas stations, it's kind of everywhere you live. And so you're right, we do take advantage of it. The point that I don't necessarily perhaps agree with in kind of the construct of the English or the British model is that then music becomes only for those who can afford it. And I grew up in a very lower socioeconomic, small, tiny town, and we had a music teacher. And boy, if I didn't have her, I would never have been able to afford to go to a singing school or to belong to a chorus. We lived too far away to drive, and we just didn't have any money to belong to a club like that. And I think that would have been a loss for me. I would have figured out something else to do. I would have been just fine as a productive member of society, but I just think my life would perhaps not have been as bright. So yeah, that is a conundrum. I think that's something that we constantly need to be evaluating and then being better at articulating that whenever we are speaking about the importance of music ed. On a kind of little side note or a little different vein of that conversation is then are we careful about not being perceived as trying to advocate for our jobs, or are we advocating for our children? And I think that sometimes when we speak on it, and people know we're not in it for the money by any means, but that it may seem like, well, I'm just trying to speak on behalf of my own career rather than people seeing the passion behind it and really the belief that providing a good music education is indeed life changing. We're just trying to convince those individuals to invest in us and to believe that themselves.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. The conundrum to me, I've been developing this line of thinking for quite a while. That to me, that conundrum, there's too much nuance to say that one of those sides of the coin is the best side. I think it's because you're right that in some systems where music education is only delivered privately, then there would be an access problem. So to me, one of the ways you find the happy medium is, take the American system again, where most of our public schools are still delivering some level of quality music education. And so you do that, but while you're doing that, we I think as educators need to trick ourselves a little bit into thinking that we still have to be a mouthpiece for the profession and for why it needs to exist. Because I think there's a certain amount of our system that has neutered our ability to do that. And here's what I mean. Take a concert, and this is again coming from my perspective as somebody who runs a nonprofit community or organization. Elise sings with me in Contorai, and and I've been running that organization for 10 years and trying to drum up audiences, convince people why they should come, convince people why what we're trying to do is important when we're raising money. And I think because so many of us have our jobs attached to some kind of tenure track / public funding / we don't have to drum up an audience because the parents' kids just show up, or the kids have their parents come and you have this built-in audience. I've been doing both of those for so long that I see that stark contrast of how little I have to worry at the high school level, for example, that people will show up to my concert. And then I go up to a Contorai concert, and it's a stress all the way until I walk out onto the stage to perform with the singers. Is anyone going to come? And so I think there's a certain amount of healthy aspect to that if we were all to be telling the story, even though we don't have to, of why people should come. So let's say you're a high school choir teacher. Do you just put on a concert on the calendar and then let people show up? Or do you put a concert on the calendar and then send out a newsletter talking to the parents about all the things their kids have accomplished, the things that they've learned, share a moment or two of really exciting things that happened in the class. And by the way, when you come next Tuesday to the concert, you're going to see all this really hard work that they've done. Can we find a happy medium as educators where we are both delivering to the masses, but also conveying a product that is worth something? Like that, even though we don't charge a ticket, you should maybe pay for one, even if I think there's a certain amount of selling of our art form that we could do, even though we have it in our public schools.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I think that is spot on. I think that we've got to be living with both feet in each of those worlds 100% of the time. And there are some easy things that teachers can think about creating, a concert preparation checklist. First of all, the students of what you do are the best advocates. So helping not condition necessarily, but train or coach your students on reminding them to share with people about how much they love music. I think adults and legislators and important people who are making important policy decisions listen to children the most, because those are prospective voters in their future. So the students, and then thinking exactly what you said, thinking about promoting yourself, your concert, coming up with a kind of a brand identity. The more visible you are, the more people are going to feel that you are a very important part of the community, an important part of your children's education. And then being able to reach out, not just send out a letter or just communicate with your parents, but then make an effort to send invitations to your mayor, make invitations to, and know who your district representatives are in your area. Send them invitations to your concert, invite them to come and maybe introduce or just recognize them. We have Mr. Dan Hageman here from the Northwest District, and he's here representing that's one of the folks who's in my legislators in my area, inviting those people to come and partake in that community event, thinking about inviting even your administrators' perspectives of what you do, your perspectives of what you do. Those are really important things that you can create a checklist and just go down the line and think about, how can I be visible in order to share my message? And then the message needs to be consistent, and there needs to be some continuity. Not like music is so great because it helps math scores. Well, is that correlation or causation? That's a whole other discussion.
Right.
But really think about, you're developing human beings. It's a very rigorous academic skill, this is important in your child's life. This is going to be a skill they can carry with them for the remainder of their days. So
Yep.
it's
Yeah, and I think that you're right. Is that need to be visible in your community as the music teacher. Sometimes I've had conversations that lead me to believe that this is true. That many music educators are shy to do that in a sense that it seems like they feel like they're being self-promotional in a negative way slash egotistical slash whatever. But one thing we have to remember is that the more visible you are in your community, the harder it would be to take your program away or
absolutely,
or damage it or
absolutely.
and that might be the cynic in me a little bit but
No, I think that's accurate.
but I think yeah if you are a part of the community, people know you at the grocery store. um, you've been teaching generations of that town's kids, and they their kids have you in class. You are an institution. And if you've done your job, of course, that they then see that as important. And if you are, I'm going to say, I'm going to call it a clock puncher, the teacher who shows up and clocks in and delivers instruction in the classroom, and then is never visible outside of that to the kids and to the program, then you run the risk of being very expendable, in my opinion. And so I think that's important.
And for those individuals who feel like they are afraid of being boastful, it's an easy fix. Make sure that you're always talking about your students. If you're talking about yourself, then that's probably an issue. If you're talking about how great you are, that's an issue.
Hmm.
But if you're talking about, look at what my students are doing, look at the lives are being changed, look at the joy on their face, look at the collaboration, these higher level thinking skills, these problem solving skills, this ability to express themselves in an appropriate and meaningful manner, which is a skill that we're struggling with, I think, in our country right now. We just kind of go out and blurt out with what we say instead of internalizing and processing it and coming up with an appropriate response. That's I want to encourage all of my music teacher friends at every level. Do not be afraid to speak about what your children are doing. That is completely acceptable. Now, if you're on, Facebook or social media, Twitter, Instagram, and you're talking about how amazing you are, then that might set differently with your community. So that's a quite an easy thing to
Right.
fix.
And I think there's some nuance. I agree. I think there's some nuance there too, though, in the sense that we have to be careful not um, uh, uh, to allow our skills as educators to be seen as interchangeable and dispensable either. And the way I think about that too is you can uh, convey a message to the community that what you're doing in your classroom, and this is again, I'm speaking with my music educator hat on, that what you're doing in the classroom is of a high level, of high value. Um, and there is a certain implication that when you do that, that has to do with you as a teacher. But then, of course, the other part of it, you're exactly right. That's a two-sided coin. You can't just be a good teacher in a classroom without students that work hard and that learn and grow. Because the way I think of it is, if you are, I had this conversation actually just not too long ago, where I used the example of if you are a plumber, no one drives by the plumbing truck on the highway and sees the sign that says, we're the best plumber in 3 counties. Call us and we will plumb you. I don't know plumber words. And, and no one drives by that truck and goes, wow, that egotistical a-hole. They see that as like that person, it believes in their skills and they think you should hire them and not the other schmuck down the road who also might plumb, right? So to me, I don't see why, as music educators, we're so special, where we wouldn't have to advocate for our art form, but also for the expertise that we worked so hard to acquire. And I think you can do that without saying, "Look at me," there are ways to. I think just it's to me, it's about conveying value. It's here's this thing I'm doing with my kids. Here's why I think it's important. And if people see that as excellent, great. But I always believe that if you have to tell people it's excellent, then it might not be.
Yeah, fair enough. That's very true.
So let them make the decision about. In other words, if whether or not it's excellent. I think our job is to tell people, here's what we're doing, here's why it's important. And then again, with my other hat on with Contrai, it's completely private sector. If we don't convince people to come to our thing instead of the other thing, then we go out of business. So there's that element too, and I think that's why that's an important perspective that in what other profession could you never tell people that what you do is good and still expect to make a living?
Well, that's an interesting perspective too, because I think in music and even in public education, especially at middle and high school, you're still having to recruit your students to be in the program. You're still having to convince, whereas the math teacher, science teacher, all the students are in the program because that's a part of the required course for their baccalaureate degree. So
Yep.
it's very good. Learning how to self-promote is extremely important.
Yeah, I think it just has to do ultimately with your personality and how you do that. I think that for us as a profession to grow and to take the next step, uh, I think that it can't be really optional to do that. In other words, to be visible in the community, like we talked about, to advocate for why what we do is important. If we ever expect to not be that culture that thinks of choirs or choral singing as something kids do, kids and old people, to adopt some of that choral music and choral singing is something that the 28-year-old lawyer can do in a community choir while he's doing some other career, and that it can be really a lifelong passion for everyone who is involved in it. I think we have to start doing more to explain to people how it changes lives and how it forms lives, and part of that is explaining to people what we do, and what it is that we actually do, and telling that story.
Oh, one thing that I want to add here too, and is if people want to continue telling that story and support music education and advocacy efforts at more of a state level, I would love to invite any of your Missouri resident listeners to attend our Music Education Advocacy Day in April. And that's at Jefferson City on April 15th. And we will be visiting, encouraging those individuals who would like to attend to contact their legislators. We have talking points that the Network Advocacy Council will help provide, and actually sit down with legislators one-on-one and talk about these things that we have been discussing over the last 30 minutes or so. And if you would like that, then we'll find a way to get that information to you.
That's great. And if Elise, if you, after we're offline, I'll have you send me a link to, if there is one, to that information for that meeting, and I'll simply embed it in the website that is will be the home base for this episode. That way, when people go and listen to it, they'll be able to see not only who you are, information about you, but then we can attach really however many links you think people should see on this topic.
Absolutely. I think and for your listeners to be encouraged that we don't feel like someone else will do this for you. I want to encourage you to become active in this area, even if you don't know where to start, even if you don't know what to do. You take you step by step, so we're not just throwing you automatically in the deep end, but we really love to gain a great visibility in our state. And so often we think about advocacy only at in our building, at our community, but we really need to step up and join together to create one voice, no pun intended, to share our concerns with those folks in Jefferson City. Because if you're not visible, you're not on their mind.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And for people who are not in Missouri, would you say it's safe to say that efforts like this are underway in most U.S. states? And is this a pretty common effort, or is Missouri unique?
Well, this is one of a few states that are beginning this kind of effort toward a more organized network. Of This was our advocacy council is funded by a country music association grant that was awarded last year, and this is kind of a 5-year project, 3 to 5 year project that we're undertaking. But to contact your Missouri or your state association in music education is important, but then also don't feel like you have to wait for something like that. Go onto um, your state government website, find what district you're in, find your legislators' names, and begin a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Have your kids write, your students write letters or send videos or anything. Start inviting these people, because they're not going to think that you're valuable unless you begin a conversation. Out of sight, out of mind. So I can't encourage you enough to begin that as a part of your advocacy efforts.
So bottom line, if your state doesn't have something like Elise has described that we have in Missouri, maybe you would be the one to go start it. Maybe if there isn't a committee, start the conversation in your state for uh, your name, NAFME. We're not supposed to pronounce the F, but your name, organization, whatever chapter, maybe that's where you need to start one. So I think that's a really good advice. Dr. Hepworth, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about this. I think this has been very constructive, and I hope people come out of this with some tools and some language to start driving this conversation wherever they are.
It's been a pleasure, Chris. Thank you so much for this invitation.
Well, thank you so much, and we will be in touch soon.
Great. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for sticking around to the end of the episode. That must mean you got something out of it. So, if that's the case, I am glad you enjoyed. If you did not enjoy, but yet for some reason still subjected yourself to an hour of the episode, go ahead and give a rating and give some comments on the platform that you listen to the show on. Any type of feedback from you is helpful in steering the direction of the show. A couple other ways you can do that. You can follow me on Twitter at Coralosophy. You can also find the same show name on Facebook and on Instagram. You can email coralosophy@gmail.com. And of course, the home base for the show is coralosophy.com, where you can also find supplementary materials on the show, including some of the documents and the links that Elise just talked about in that episode. Of course, also, I would be remiss to not mention on the way out to head by coralosophy.com and check out the sponsors page so that you can see some great offers and discounts from all of the institutions and awesome choral products that sponsor the show. Thanks so much, and I hope you'll just keep on listening into part 2 of this episode, where I will chat with Dale Trumbore about telling our stories on the performance side of choral music.